We are in the middle of a book that is broken into 3 parts, and you should be able to easily identify those 3 parts. The 3 parts of Numbers. The first 10 chapters of Numbers are all about what part of the journey? Preparation and the census. So 1 through 10 is about a preparation and a census and the count to get people ready. It's the organizational structure, but behind that, there are several things that need to happen. They're constructing the way in which they're going to move forward and how to work together. How to know what a trumpet call calls you to. How to know which is battle and which is marching formation. How did they know when to leave where they were? How did they know it was time to move on? They were instructed by God, and as the cloud would go up or the pillar of fire would move, and God gave them, in essence, a GPS system that said, this is where you're going and how to get there. But beyond working together, they also had to make some tough choices and learn to defend themselves. They had been through an Amalekite battle, but really they haven't met that many people. You're out in the middle of the wilderness. Chances of bumping into large tribes of people coming by are not really great. But as they move toward the land of Canaan, they're going to run into more populated areas, and then they're going to need to know how to march in straight lines. It's going to be relatively unimpressive to anyone if you bring a rabble out there, everybody kind of falling all over each other. You may kill them all laughing at each other, but that's about all the way you're going to be able to take them on in warfare. They needed to learn defense. So what we have is this entire part is at Sinai. It represents 19 days of time at Sinai. And then we get into the heart of it from chapter 11. And we begin in chapter 11 to see a change. It's the middle of 10, actually, where they begin moving. And they move from Sinai to Nebo until chapter 20. And this is Mount Sinai to Mount Nebo, or Nebo. And this will be the place where Moses will view the promised land, and eventually Moses will die and be buried there. There'll be a fight over his body. All of that happens here. So this is the actual journeying part. And then the last part of it, from 21 all the way to the end of the book, will relate specifically to preparing to enter the land. So 21 to 36, you're going to be on prep to enter. This is overlooking the land. So the journey is in the center. I want to highlight 2 chapters out of this. I want to highlight chapter 12 and chapter 13, and both of those chapters become the pivotal moment in the book. So we're at a great spot in this book. Chapter 13, of course, any Bible student will recognize is the story of the spies, but chapter 12 is the setup of that story. And in fact, it starts in 11, where there's complaining in the camp. And God decides, after they have passed by the edge of the wilderness and have left the Egyptian area, they come out into the wilderness of Shur, the great and terrible wilderness, and up into the wilderness of Paran. And when they get there, there's some people that start complaining. Who was it that started complaining? The rabble, Hatzavtzuf. The rabble. And those people start, and they're on the edges of the camp. So what does God do? He sends a little sound and light show to singe the edges of the camp. He doesn't kill people, but he burns a few tents to make a point. In other words, that's God's knock it off. I'm not happy with what's going on. Now, chapter 12 introduces the next wave. They have gone through a complaint about the menu, and after the complaint about the menu, God sent them quail, which ended in body bags and cemeteries. They are barely over that. There is never a time in leadership and ministry that you're not going to get caught up in a situation where when the devil gives you one punch, he's following it with another. Don't drop your guard after you take the first punch, because you're about to get hit with a second one. And the second punch is going to be harder, closer, and faster than the first one. The first one's going to be public. The second one's going to be private. I got a dozen illustrations for this and very few that I can share. But here's what happens. Some public criticism is made about your leadership or what you're doing in ministry, and then some person you thought was close to you responds to that. and now what you're feeling is knifed in the back. That's about to happen in chapter 12. Now, I need you to see that 12 is going to be complaints of a personal nature in Moses' life. So somewhere on your chapter 12, it'll be Moses' family complains about Moses, okay? It's going to be hard-hitting, below-the-belt punches, because they're only going to pick on things like who he chose to marry, because that's not very personal, you know, our choice of a spouse. And chapter 13 will follow up with another story that is the sending in of the spies. But you need to understand, there's a reason that they're hooked together. Chapter 11, chapter 12, public and personal attacks by the enemy precede the greatest moment of breakthrough possibility in the ministry. 13's the moment when they could step in there and they could believe Joshua and Caleb and they could cut 40 years off of wandering around the wilderness. They won't, but they could. And here's the thing, coming up on that, the enemy knows that as well. And so he plants bombs to go off one after the other that will blow up the camp. First, the complaints by the rabble, then the complaints over the menu, then the complaints by his family, and all of that precedes coming in and having that moment to send out the spies. I think that Moses was tired already, and the bulk of the 40 years was still in front of him. Give him a break, he's 81. It's hot all day and cold all night. And there's nothing particularly less rewarding than having thousands of murmuring Israelites surrounded by a brother and sister that don't like your wife. This is just a really good dysfunctional situation. So, if I was going to put a key principle on top of chapter 12, it would look something like this. We need to be careful about how we use our mouth. God takes words seriously. If you just want 4 words for it, God takes words seriously. And I can't even begin to teach this passage without telling you that as a verbal person, there are several students here that I have heard so far this year, if I add up everything they have said, it still comes to less than half a page. Some of them, it comes to less than 2 lines on a page. But those of us who are verbal, who say a lot of stuff, have a lot of sympathy for people who are out on election stumps. And I'll tell you why. You're going to say something stupid. When you talk a long time, you're going to say something stupid. You can script it as much as you want. You're going to say something stupid. And what we need to do is understand that James 3 warns us of the tongue and its damage. Take a look at chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, and we're going to start off by the setting. The setting is 12, 1 to 3. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, "Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not also spoken through us as well?" And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very humble, more than any man who was on the face of the earth. Let's just stop there for a second. Notice first of all in verse 1 the timing. It's all in one word, then. On the backside of the body bags from the menu complaints and the quail, it's at that moment they decided to open their mouth and object to his wife. They're not just meeting her. They have known her for a while, but now they decided to register their objection because standing next to the cemetery and recognizing that a large number of people have just angered the Lord really wasn't discouraging enough to Moses, so they had to pile on top. You know I'm deliberately being snide about that. This is a spiritual attack as much as it is any other kind of attack. And you need to understand that in every ministry situation, if the enemy can wound the leader, he can bring down the work, or at least call it to a halt. And so it's not a coincidence. It was a planned shot at a weakened time. The second thing I would tell you is that in verse 1, after the word then, notice the agents of the stab. The agents of this are those who are closest to Moses, Miriam and Aaron. They've been there since the beginning. They've been there for all the miracles, all the stuff, all the plagues, all the cool things that happened in Moses' life. And by the way, it's really, really hard when they're that familiar to have a high level of respect. One of the problems we have in ministry is that we try to be very accessible to one another, but that accessibility can lead to a familiarity that leads to a contempt. That we start treating God's holy things in a casual way. Don't misunderstand me. Not me. You. I need to view you as a gift of God placed in my life for a little while, for me to pour out what I can in you and for you to pour out what you can in each other. But do not mistake the fact that your roommate has an incredible path to walk with God. Don't act like they're just everybody and just anyone. They've given the time to study God's Word because God called them to do something. They don't know what it is yet, but it's going to be cool. And what you need to do is be able to step back and see that. I've said it often, Grace Church needs to see that when God puts a young person in that youth group down the hall, God has given us a sacred trust to do something with that person. When God gives us that cane-toting little old lady, God is giving us someone that we get the opportunity to pour into, and we don't have each other for very long. So when you treat the things that God is giving you as an incredible gift, and you just treat them in a casual way, you demean the God who gave them to you. Now, I know there's a lot of ways to look at this second half of verse 1 because of the Cushite woman whom he had married. By the way, it looks like that when Moses is recording this, he's stuttering, right? Because he married a Cushite woman. It's actually a duplication. Many scholars don't believe the second phrase actually goes in there. I don't think that this is another wife. In my view, he only had one wife, Zipporah. I don't think she was a Cushite. I think she looked like one. Moses got married to a Midianite girl who was the daughter of who? Jethro, whose other name was, his title was? Reuel. Good. And when he was on the run, this is all the way back in Exodus 3 and 4, and this is when he's on the run, and he marries this girl. Now, it's very clear if you follow the book of Exodus that in Exodus 18 it says that Moses had two sons by Zipporah. One of them was by the name of Gershom, which means alien. The other one, Eleazar, is the mighty one of my father. It seems like he's still feeling like a stranger when the first child comes along, and he's feeling a little better that God is really leading him by the second one, and so he's had a bit of a revival, and so he names his kids. I can't tell you that, but it certainly sounds like he did better on the second naming than the first. But in Exodus 4, Moses' wife derided him for not circumcising his child. Do you remember that? You are a father of blood to me. Threw back a foreskin at him and said, you make me do this. Once again, Moses was ready to lead a nation, but he couldn't lead his own family. And God nearly took his life because he didn't do what God told him to do in his family life. There's a good warning in Exodus 4 that the first line of ministry is the first line God gave you. Now, what's interesting to me is that it's very clear if you look at Exodus 4:24 that Moses left camp with God's orders only with Aaron, his brother, to go to Pharaoh. There's no indication that Zipporah goes with him. So it doesn't appear that Miriam meets his wife at the beginning. It means he shows up with his brother Aaron and they're doing that let my people go thing, but Zipporah's back at the farm. Well, it's not much of a farm. You got to know what Midian looks like. Think Afghanistan with tents. Okay, so it's maybe a low-budget farm. But here's the thing. In Exodus 18, when Jethro visits Moses, it's intended to tell you the story that her return to her husband was not until they went into the desert. So it means that she's probably missed all of that incredible work. God has been doing amazing things through Moses to get him back into the wilderness, but she's not there for that. She doesn't drop into the story until he's already on the path coming out of the wilderness. And that means that Miriam meets Zipporah later on in the story. Now, I'm not going to say anything. There's more women in the room than there are men, so I'm going to navigate this just as clearly and cleanly as I can. But I have two daughters, and I happen to know what the one-upsmanship sounds like when two girls get together and each one is trying to make themselves feel a little better and more significant to the overall program. So I think the story goes something like this. I think Zipporah, her name means bird, and I think Zipporah comes out And she's kind of pushing around Miriam. You know, my husband is really the center of this camp. I mean, my husband, he is really the one God is working through. And Miriam's going, now listen, zip it, Zep. And I think what comes out of this is she starts calling her a Cushite. I think she looks at her and sees the physical Ethiopian aspect of her physical person and picks up on her dark skin and calls her a Cushite. And I think the bottom line is, she's not named in the text not because it's somebody different than Zipporah. In my view, this is what they're calling her. So I think what they're doing is going, this is what he married. Now, what I know about Zipporah is that that's only going to make her feel worse about who she is, which is going to up the ante on the number of things she runs around telling them at all the picnics about how good her husband is. And this is only going to cause a problem. The bottom line is, it appears to me the problem isn't polygamy, it's personal prejudice. And it's not prejudice against what you think. The fact of the matter is, if you read the text very closely in verse 2, their issue isn't really with her. Their real issue is jealousy. And so their personal choice of Moses was not one they liked. I think she stepped on their toes, but give her a break. Zipporah came into the story after this story was being well played. We're halfway through the book of Exodus before she gets in the narrative. So she's not up to speed on feeling good about herself, and so she pushes the I'm with Moses. And that makes the others feel uncomfortable. In verse 2 it says, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? That's the stab that was a complaint of a deeper problem. They were feeling slighted. Something she was saying made them feel slighted. What's clear is that they weren't just mocking wedding photos. They were hurt by something. And when the complaining started in the camp, back at the beginning of chapter 11, Moses got hit, and so did his family. And you know what complaining's like? It's like yawning. As soon as somebody starts, other people pick up on it, and then all of a sudden it's everywhere. And one of the things that I noticed is that the enemy disrupted the camp, and he wasn't leaving until the disruption became a permanent scar on Moses' life, because that's what he's trying to do. You have to understand, he starts fanning the flames of the rabble, not to use a pun there, but he's fanning the flames of the rabble on the outside of the camp to get the complaints to spread, because the enemy wants to get that all the way into Moses' heart. That's the arrow he's trying to shoot. Dead Israelites from the quail incident weren't barely cold when the enemy started to work on killing any relief that the leader was going to feel by bringing up complaints right inside the leader's family. Now, did you notice the problem Miriam and Aaron wanted to express? They were jealous of Moses' recognition. They felt their contribution was vital. Was it? Did Aaron play a role in the let my people go thing? He's the one who was holding the stick with the snakes. There were some cool things that they did, but the issue wasn't the history of God's prophetic voice. It was recognition for what God had done. And the important thing is, you're going to find that that is the classic attack in ministry. Here's the bottom line. None of us deserve the ministry positions we have. None of us. And none of us can do ministry effectively. I can change exactly no hearts, but I'm consistent. I can change no hearts. And the reality is that what happens is, if you really want to get inside of a leader's mind or his heart, what you do is you angle him on competition. You start telling him that the other guy's getting more recognition than he is. You start telling her that the other ministry is getting backed better than her ministry is. And you start angling that little closed shell open to get them jealous. Those of us in ministry, I don't know if you know this, but I'm going to share it with you anyway. People who stand up in front of people, there's a certain amount of ego involved in teaching. If I didn't think I had anything to say, I wouldn't stand up. The other side of that is that there's a battle of self-worth. I don't know if you know that. I think that people that do public ministry come off as being quite self-sufficient, when in fact, I deliver a message on Sunday, or several of them, and they've been beating me all week or all month. And I don't hardly get on top of the sin from last week's message that I'm feeling bad about, and I got to roll out another couple of messages to hit another couple of highlighted sins from Randy's life. And I don't know if people put that together, but here's the thing. In a room full of other leaders and spiritual men, and I've been in the room with some really good ones, almost all of them deal with self-worth. That's one of the reasons why early on in your ministry you have to come to the conclusion that if you need recognition for doing what God called you to do, get it from Him. If you need it from anybody else, you're dangerous. So here's the reality. It's possible that a leader becomes more popular with people but less popular with God. And so you can't get into the situation where you're chasing after how people feel. Now notice the problem in verse 2. The stab against Moses was fine. But in verse 2 it says, and the Lord heard it. There's the heart of your problem. Until God hears it, you can meh all you want. But when God heard it, here's the warning of the lesson. God happens to be listening to what we're saying. Our mouths are being monitored. Our complaints are being overheard. Our blasphemies are recorded. And the important thing is our lies have been scrutinized. Our exaggerations have been dissected by God. Our boasts have been examined. And all of them have been looked over by someone whose name is truth. Now that's a tough standard. So right in the middle of the story, there's this insertion. Now Moses was a very humble man. I happen to think that's inserted. I'm going to go on record as saying I don't think Moses wrote, by the way, Moses was a very humble man. I think that sort of negates the whole thing if he wrote it there, right? You know, I'm so humble that I had to tell you about it. That's kind of not good. Now, why put that in the writing? Because God wanted something incredibly clear. It wasn't Moses that was seeking retribution against his siblings. Not that any of us with siblings don't understand wanting retribution against our siblings. The things my brother broke of mine. I'm not bitter, I'm just saying. But here's the thing, God had his ear on the camp. Moses wasn't a snitch. That's what that line says. This wasn't Mo going, you got to take him down, God. That's not what's going on here. Now in verses 4 to 13, I want you to see something. This is God's response. And God answered the sin of Miriam and Aaron with first word and then symbol. He wanted to make a point that was going to stick with both of them, and he wanted us to read about the point. I wonder why. Well, first, there's a verbal encounter with God at the tabernacle. Look at verse 4. Suddenly the Lord said to Moses and Aaron and to Miriam, you three come out of the tent of meeting. So the three came out. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the doorway of the tent, and he called Aaron and Miriam. And when they had both stepped forward, he said, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, shall make myself known to him in a vision. I shall speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, even openly, and not in dark sayings. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses? I've read those words on numerous occasions. And I've come to the conclusion that we all get very casual about how we handle things. And I try to weigh out very carefully that men and women that God has called in different posts of ministry around the world, even when I disagree with them, I need to be careful about how I address that disagreement. Because God called them. Who are you to judge another's servant? And since they work for Jesus and not for you, you want to be a little bit careful. That doesn't mean you buy into their error. It doesn't mean that you bypass their error. It means that you treat them with respect. The issue here is not accountability, it's recognition. You need to know that all leaders and all believers have to be accountable to one another. And in fact, if you looked in Galatians 6 or James 5 or Matthew 18, you would see an accountability structure that's in the Bible. The bottom line is, since the issue was recognition and perceived importance in the ministry, as well as the personality and prejudices of people, this whole thing should look a little different to you. Maybe Miriam didn't like the fabric choices that Zipporah put on Moses' tent. Maybe she didn't like the way Zipporah played the tambourine at the tabernacle sing-along. I don't know. Maybe she didn't like her looks, her perfume, or her favorite joke. Who cares? The truth is, all that's a surface problem. The real issue is affirmation. Leaders have to learn to listen longer so they can figure out what the real problem is. Because most of the time people are bringing it to you, but they don't actually know what the problem is. So the truth of the matter is you can get to the point as a leader where you're disconnected from what's going on. But here's an important issue, and I want you to see this. Moses is wrestling with issues before God that even his brother and sister didn't understand, and that's what God was telling them. You need to understand something. When I meet with your brother Mo, I talk to him like I talk to nobody else you know. I lean into him face to face, and I let him know things I don't tell anybody else. So when you walk around going, I don't like who he married, you need to know you're messing with the only guy in the camp that has kept you from being a post-toasty at this point, because I was ready to kill you all. Now, God said it in a more patient and poetic and loving way. You get me. The point is that Moses had just come from dealing with God on an issue of complaint. Don't forget that. We can't know how long that event or the one before it was with God. What we know is that God said, when I deal with Moses, I do it on a level that I don't do with anybody else. Would you remember this? Everybody you're going to deal with is wrestling with their own dragons. And God is dealing with them on a different level than he's dealing with you. And it's very possible that you think you understand a situation by standing outside of it. And God is communicating on another level in that person's life. So it's worth thinking through before you criticize. Now, the second thing I noticed is there's a powerful symbol that was given to Miriam. And it was, apparently she was the more vocal of the two. I'm taking that because she got the worst punishment of the two, and I know that as a dad, that's what I usually do. I don't think you can base a lot on that, but I really think that she got it, she was the one being mouthy, so she's the one who got the big symbol. Verse 9. So the anger of the Lord burned against them, and he departed. But when the cloud had withdrawn from over the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous, white as snow. As Aaron turned toward Miriam, behold, she was leprous, meaning he went, ugh. Then Aaron said to Moses, oh, my Lord, I beg you, do not account this sin to us, in which we have acted foolishly, and in which we have sinned. Do not let her be like one who's dead, whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes from his mother's womb. So Miriam needed a 7-day lesson, so God gave her a week off with leprosy outside the camp. Aaron needed the graphic reminder, don't mess. Don't mess around. Don't participate in the gossip and the complaining. And in verses 13 to 16, what you get are the results of their sin. Because there is a price to be paid for sin. Just remember this. Your choice isn't just about you. It's also about the people around you. I pled with a young man who was leaving his wife. Don't do this. You are not just hurting her. You're hurting your children. You're hurting your relationships all around you. You have no idea how far this is going to carry. Do not do this, because your sin isn't just about you. It's about all the people around you. Here's the thing. If you see it in verse 13, the first thing that happened is it grieved God's leader. Moses fell down broken before the Lord. So it says, Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, oh God, heal her, I pray. But the Lord said to Moses, if her father had spit in her face, would she not bear her shame for 7 days? Let her be shut up for 7 days outside the camp, and afterwards she may be received again. He said, look, even if an earthly father had found her in a compromised position and publicly spit in her face, it would be 7 days before she would approach him again. Don't ask me to do less than a dad would do. Send her outside the camp. You have to be a little bit impressed with the selfless nature of the man, don't you? Because few of us would have taken criticism so well. But Moses had developed a very thick skin under the Sinai sun. And he really wasn't all about, she hurt me. That's a lesson for leadership. You can't lead if you don't have thick skin. There are going to be people who disagree with you honestly, and then there are going to be people who just get mean. in reality, it's kind of interesting here because he wasn't given to reaction before men. But if you look at Moses' life, when he walked in before God, he was ripping his beard out, going, I can't take this anymore. In front of people, he was like, oh, Lord, don't harm them. When he got alone with God, he was like, if you don't stop these people, they're driving me over the edge. I love that, because that's the pattern of ministry. There is a place you can take your pain, just not to your roommate, to your Savior. So the second thing I noticed is that not only did it grieve God's leader in verse 13, but it stopped God's people. See, nobody moved for a week. They were frozen for 7 days. Nobody could move forward. Verse 15 says, so Miriam was shut outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not move on until Miriam was received again. Afterward, however, the people moved out from Hatzerot and camped at the wilderness of Paran. See, one sin from one person, key to the leadership, stopped the momentum of the entire group. Complaints and gossip can stall out a work for God, because God takes our word seriously. Now that's the first part of the lesson, and that sets up, now they've sat for 7 days. And when you get to 13, 1 to 33, you get to the next phase, and this is the moment. But Moses has been significantly weakened by a public disruption, a public burial and funeral, followed by a private disruption, and followed by a stalling of the people. Listen, 7 extra days standing in the hot desert because Miriam's sin is no bargain for Moses either. Now, when you get to chapter 13, and here's the key. We're only going to be here for a few minutes, so make sure you've got it. In verses 1 to 33, here's what I want you to see. Being afraid isn't the problem. It's what you do next. That's the problem. I want you to understand God understands fear. He's not mad at you because you get afraid. By the way, some fears are planted in you. When you look off the side of the ledge, you should be afraid. People who aren't die falling off the side of ledges. Smart people don't try to mess with gravity any more than they have to. Being afraid isn't our biggest problem. Responding incorrectly is our biggest problem. So, in verses 1 through 20, look at the instruction. Now, I'm only going to do this very quickly, but take a look at the instruction. It's the first 20 verses. It says this, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Send out for yourself men, so that they may spy out the land of Canaan, which I am going to give to the sons of Israel. You shall send a man from each of the fathers' tribes, every one a leader among them. So Moses sent from the wilderness of Paran, at the command of the Lord, all the men who were heads of the wilderness of Israel. And then it starts to list off the people all the way down until you get to verse 15. Verse 16 is where I want to pick it up. These are the names of the men whom Moses sent out to spy the land, but Moses called Joshua, Yehoshua, Hoshea, son of Nun. And when Moses sent them out to spy out the land of Canaan, he said to them, Go up there into the Negev, go through the hill country, see what kind of land it is, whether the people who live there are strong or weak, whether they're few or many, how the land is in which they live. Is it good or is it bad? How are the cities in which they live? Are they open camps or are they fortified? How is the land? Is it fat or is it lean? Are there trees? Are there not? Make an effort to get some of the fruit of the land. And now the time was the time of the first ripe grapes. Now here's the thing. The story begins with an instruction from God. That's verse 1. Go send the spies. And if you keep looking at it, you have to remember that obedience is always a call to courage. Obedience is always a call to courage. Disobedience is easy. Oh, I don't mean getting caught being disobedient is easy. I mean being disobedient is easy. You never really have to work up to disobedience. Have you noticed that? Disobeying is always easier than obeying. So obedience is a call to courage. But here's the thing. In verse 2 through 16, they were to send one man from each tribe. And so it goes and ticks them off from Reuben, Simeon, Judah, Issachar, Ephraim, Benjamin, Zebulun, Manasseh, Dan, Asher, Naphtali, Gad. And then it says, it's not in order of the rank. I think it's in the order they showed up. There's no order to this that I can make sense of. I think it's the order that the guys showed up. All right, all of you send me a guy. And so they came in, and as they came in, they wrote them down, and that's the list you've got. And here's the heart of the matter. God did not keep them from a realistic view of what they were facing. He sent the spies in there so they could know what they were up against. Somebody's going to go, look, I don't know about you guys, but I'm a chicken for pain. I personally like my dentist, and I know that the size of that needle would get me out of the chair. So I like that he does this, kind of does this around here and kind of goes, now look over there, and then kind of takes out this thing, which I imagine to be about this big, and shoves it in my mouth. I don't need to see the dental equipment before it goes in. One of the weirdest things that ever happened is when I broke this leg and they decided to put this hardware sale items in it, I ended up with 13 screws down the outside of my leg and another stainless screw on the inside of my leg. And the guy bothered to show them to me first. And I was like, I have been to Home Depot. I don't need to see this. And then he says, now what we do, and he takes a plastic model and he says, we take these screws and we drill into the, no, don't show me this. Put me out. I want to wake up and I want you to say, now you can dance. I couldn't dance before, but while you're doing it. Look, it's in the nature of people to minimize what's ahead if it's something they desire, and to maximize what's ahead if it's something they dread. Nobody tells the truth. The guy who wants to do it makes it easier. Oh, it'll be a breeze. The guy who doesn't want to do it, you can't imagine how hard it's going to be. And here's the thing. When you buy the house, all the fix-up is going to be a breeze. Salesman's going to be, yes, it's quaint. That means it's falling apart and small. It's rustic. It means, you're going to need another bank book just to do what needs to be done. The point is that everybody's going to make it seem easy when they're trying to get you to buy in. But once you're in, that same guy will come back as his brother-in-law will come in as a contractor and go, oh, what a mess. You can't believe what we're going to have to do to this. I want you to understand that in verses 21 to 24, you have a simple record of a journey. We're almost done. And look at the journey. They went up, verse 21. They spied out the land of the wilderness of Zin, as far as Rehov and Livo Hamat. And they had gone up into the Negev. And they went to Hebron, where Achiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of the Anakim, those are the giants in the land, the Anak, were there. Now, Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt, which doesn't really help you because you don't know when Zoan in Egypt was built, but otherwise it's a really helpful statement. Verse 23, then they came to the valley of Eshcol, and there they cut down a branch and with a single cluster of grapes, and they carried them out on a pole between two men with some of the pomegranates and the figs. And that place was called the Valley of Eshcol because of the cluster which the sons of Israel cut down from their. Eshcol means cluster. Even today, the ministry of tourism symbol in Israel is two guys carrying a big cluster of grapes, because the word te'er is also the word spy. It's also the word tourist. So when you come, we know why you're there. The point is that, so the ministry of spies or ministry of tourism, right? Here's the important thing. They go through the Negev Depression. They come up into the south part of the country. They end up in a very beautiful area. I love that area of the country. And they're there when the tirosh, the fresh grapes are just coming in. They bypass all the camps. And as they're walking by, they can see the hill of Hebron. That would be the place for Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. I mean, they're passing by their roots. And they're going up there and they're remembering the stories of men who are in their background, who encountered God in faith, and now they're making their way all the way up. Let me offer some advice. When God's calling you to do something that requires conviction and courage, take a look back at some of the men and women God has used in the past. Because it's going to help you to know when you're walking by Hebron and you're remembering what God did for Abraham, it's going to help you to remember God never brings his people out on the end of a limb and then cuts the limb off. If you need courage, look in the book. That's part of its value. You look back to what God had already done. And here's the thing. God didn't only do this for them, he recorded it for you. So you have a record of it. Now, verse 25, when they returned from spying out the land, by the way, 25 to 29 is the spies' return. Dun, dun, dun. When they returned from spying out the land at the end of 40 days, they proceeded to come to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the sons of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. And when they brought back word to them, and the congregation showed up with them with the fruit of the land, thus they told them, we went into the land. Yeah? Where you sent us, yeah? And it certainly does flow with milk and honey. Amen. Oh, hallelujah. And this is its fruit. Oh, great. Nevertheless, they were doing so well. They were doing great. The people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And moreover, we saw descendants of the Anakim there. Amalek is living in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites and Jebusites and Amorites are living in the hill country, and the Canaanites are living by the sea and by the side of the Jordan. They're gone 40 days. They finally return. They come to Moses and Aaron. They come at the middle of this camp that looks like it's sitting in the middle of a lunar landscape, coming back with grapes, pomegranates, and figs. And the initial report is, we did what we were instructed. The land is zub. It's gushing. That's what it says. It's gushing agriculture. Here's some sample fruit. But the people are odds. It's the word rugged. It's the word for fierce. The cities are batsar. It's the word for impregnable. See, they didn't say they were big. They said they're unbreachable. You're never going to get in. Well, now that would be true if you didn't have the God who created 1 quintillion stars. Because he's busy spinning planets. I'm not thinking that their stone walls are really going to be a real lift effort for him. The God who made the rock they built the wall from is probably a good bet that he can take the wall down. The children of the Anakim, the giants in the land. Now, a couple things are clear about the report. One is that they traveled all the way across the whole area. Second, they saw each one of the various zones they went through and really got a good scope of the land. They saw the people. And by the way, I can take you back and show you the Bronze Age culture cities that they're talking about, because we've dug them up now, and you can see graphically. We can stand in Israel and I can show you the walls that they would have seen at that time, because they have been now archaeologically recovered. It's interesting because there was a prosperous city culture and lots of caravan trades. The hardest thing for these guys was to stay off the street when the sunlight was out there. They had to sneak under the cover of darkness and miss the caravans and not be spotted. And when they walked, they couldn't raise up any dust because it's a flat land and you can see them a far way off if they're raising up any dust. Now, it wasn't to scare them that God sent them. It was to prepare them that God sent them. It was to shake them, to help them to see the beauty of what was in front of them, because the visions of Egypt were still dancing in their head. They needed that shook out of them, and they had an opportunity, and they were standing on the edge of it. They could taste the future. They could even have it. And then you get to verses 30 to 33, and out come the recommendations. And I got to tell you, when you read the recommendations, Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "We should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we will surely overcome it." Boy, you got to love this guy. But the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against this people. They are too strong for us." And by the way, that is an absolutely accurate summary. But you're not going up without God. So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report for the land which they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone in spying out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size." You got to love this. Everybody we saw was huge. Does anybody hear what could be maybe an exaggeration in that? And then it says, they also were of the Nephilim, the sons of Anakim, of the Anakim are part of the Nephilim, the fallen ones, and they are become like grasshoppers in their own sight, and so we were in their sight. See, contrasting calls confuse the people. Caleb says, "Forward!" The other guy says, "Run!" And here's the thing, the "we are not able" is completely correct, but it's absolutely falls short of what God told. He didn't tell them to go in and do it themselves. He said, "I'm going with you." There are many believers in our day that have been poorly taught to see how God works. They believe if God's in it, it'll go smoothly. That's absolutely not true. Absolutely nobody on a mission field believes that God's only in it when it goes smoothly. You know why? Because almost nothing goes smoothly. And here's the thing. He doesn't want you to be able to fully pull off things in your strength. He wants you to have a God-sized need. Because if you can do it, he doesn't get to do it with you because you just do it. In our world, instead of calling on God to help us to meet our provisions, we whip out plastic. And then we rob God of the opportunity to do for us what he really wanted to do. You know, I love Caleb's short testimony. He called the people to move toward what God promised them. That's the thing you got to remember. This whole thing is rooted in, what did I promise you? He saw everything that the others saw, but he remembered the promises of God. So if you have anything to put at the end of the chapter, it's this simple word. He said, take possession of it. Yarash means to dispossess the other people. He didn't say take possession. He said take it out of their hands. Why? Because God told us to. Take it out of their hands. Take that ball away. Take that ball away. That's his cheer. Except for he can't get anybody in the stands to go along with him. A mature believer clothes himself in the promises of God. He's not presumptive, but he understands what the promises of God are. All right. For tonight, what I wanted you to be able to see was that the enemy took shots, first publicly, then privately, at Moses' life. That Moses, after 7 days of being parked in the desert with a leprous sister, is able to bring her back into the camp. And though things are now settling down, does anybody think that maybe Miriam and Zipporah are not really speaking well together at the well yet? I'm thinking that you just went, and that's probably going to leave a few scars. And then Moses has got to walk into the moment that's going to determine whether we're going to spend the next generation running around chasing our tails in the wilderness or walk in and take possession of what God called us to do. And it's not a mistake that all of these complaints and discouragements came up in Moses' life just before the moment that could have broken them all free. It's not a mistake. You need to understand that what happened in his private life, he needed to be able to shed as a leader to walk in and deal with the next thing. One of the hardest skills that I know of is compartmentalization. I can come out of a meeting in which somebody is very, very exercised, walk into the next meeting, and the next group doesn't know anything about the last group. And you can't make your next meeting about the last one. You need to be able to slough off your scars quickly, get in the next thing, and put yourself back in the game. And if you can't do it, you can't effectively lead.